Hi, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome to Out and About Online. My name is Matthew, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a white gay man with dark brown hair that's swooshed over to one side. I've got some facial hair. I'm wearing a green sweater, and I've got a pink pendant necklace on. I'm sitting in front of a canvas that has blue, green, and orange swipes across it, and I have a headset on with a mic. Tonight, I'm tuning in from what is now known as Washington, D.C., on the unceded lands of Piscataway, Powhatan, Pamunkey, and Anacostan peoples, amongst many other Native communities whose histories have been obscured, altered, or erased. I'm really thrilled for tonight's conversation. As a dance maker and facilitator, my personal work often celebrates and reflects on LGBTQ plus lives and experiences, and it invites a wide range of artists, community members, partners into a dance making process. I'm often interested in working at this intersection of social and creative history making and history telling, looking at these different aspects through embodied approaches and how this can help us contextualize contemporary queer issues and reimagine LGBTQ life through performance. Out and About Online is a series to bring these ideas together by inviting local leaders and artists to talk about LGBTQ plus history, art and activism, and dance as a practice for community building and community celebration. And I cannot wait to talk with the folks that we have lined up tonight. I want to take a moment, though, before we begin, to thank some people who've really made tonight possible. First, I want to thank our friends with the Humanities DC and the DC Commission of the Arts and Humanities. Tonight's program is supported by a grant from Humanities DC as part of their Humanitini grant program, an initiative funded by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. I want to thank Tyler French, who's been many things in relation to this program and this work, and tonight we'll be playing the role of stage manager. If you need any additional technical support, you can find Tyler under the stage manager moniker in the chat, and you can send him a direct message and he can help you out. I also want to thank Nora Rodriguez and Rodney Laban for being part of tonight's event, who will be providing ASL interpretation. I want to acknowledge the important work of our frontline workers, our first responders and healers, and our community leaders who are organizing resources and healing spaces in response to the global pandemic that we are continuing to navigate. I want to lift up our LGBTQ plus ancestors who sacrificed so much to make changes, and those continuing to take action to actively resist and dismantle white supremacy, police brutality, racism, misogyny, and violence against our Black communities and against our trans and non-binary community members. Lastly, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, this Thursday night, December 3rd. As you're participating, please keep in mind that there may be instances where Wi-Fi signals fluctuate, sound may go in and out, or we may experience a challenge our team just hasn't planned for. If you experience those difficulties, a reminder to connect with Tyler in the chat, and we can do what we can. Tyler, at this point, would you also bring up our community agreement slide? You may remember the community agreements that were shared through email. There we go. Thank you. Just a few quick reminders, there will be lots of ways to participate tonight. That's actually one of the main reasons we chose to move forward with the Zoom meeting format as opposed to a Zoom webinar format. We love participation and we love the kind of informal back and forth conversational feel that the meeting provides. So know that there will be lots of ways to participate, but also know that throughout all of that, you get to make a lot of choice based on where you're at and what you feel comfortable with. When you're not speaking, we ask that you keep your mic on mute so that we can better hear those who are speaking. And we also understand that we're joining from our private homes and that there may be times where turning on a camera or turning on sound may not be supportive or possible with where you are. And we welcome you to navigate the complexity of this moment as you need. I do want to also point out another quick feature that might just help streamline some of your viewing tonight, there's a special way to use the viewing feature that will enable you to see really only the boxes of folks that are talking. So if you scroll your mouse over the little arrow next to your stop video button and you click on video settings, you should find a box that says hide non-video participants. If you click that box, what that will do is once those who have turned off their videos have done so, it'll make it so that you really are just seeing the people who have their videos on and who are talking as part of the conversation. So feel free to use that feature. A note, we do want to say we are recording tonight's program, but this is for archival documentation purposes only. And lastly, we really want to invite you to use the chat feature tonight and participate by asking questions and sharing those things that really resonate with you as the conversation unfolds. As a way to practice that right now, I know that some of us have already been dropping our names and our locations into the chat, but I'd invite you to go ahead and continue to do that and just take a look at see who's coming in from where. Throughout the evening, we do ask that we keep the conversation on topic and respectful. And with that, let's go ahead and dive in. So at this point, I want to start by orienting ourselves to some of these big ideas of LGBTQ plus history. And specifically, I want to look at some of the LGBTQ plus histories here in Washington, D.C. Helping us understand a bit more about this is Jeff Donahoe with the Rainbow History Project. Jeff, would you go ahead and turn your camera and mic on? And for everyone else, a reminder, please keep your mics and cameras off for this moment.
Hey, Matthew.
Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
Okay, how are you?
I'm good. It is good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for asking. I'm really thrilled to be part of it.
So I want to make sure to introduce you first. So for those tuning in addition to his work with Georgetown Magazine, Jeff has been a longtime member with the Rainbow History Project, collecting oral histories to document, preserve, and promote local queer histories in Washington, D.C. Jeff heads up the oral history collection effort of the organization and leads tours of DuPont Circle as a historic LGBTQ plus neighborhood. So to start us out, Jeff, I'm actually wondering, I know that there are some people on the call who may be familiar with the work of Rainbow History Project and some who might not be. So could you say a bit more about the organization and your relationship to it? What do you do?
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for asking us to be part of this program. Rainbow History Project is an all-volunteer organization, all-volunteer effort with a pretty straightforward mission. You know, our mission is to collect, preserve, and then promote a deeper understanding of the active and diverse sexual identities and sexual cultures in the Washington, D.C. community. If I had just 3 seconds to say that, I would say we're your friendly local LGBT history association. So I think the thing also that's really fun to talk about is that we are just 20 years old. November 4th, 2000. The 4 people who founded the organization had their first meeting. And so we're really delighted to be heading into our 3rd decade. Yeah, it's been really great. And I think I've been involved, not at the very beginning, but before too much history had passed, so to speak. And so it's been a real treasure in my life.
Amazing, amazing. And I don't know that I heard you say too much about what you do with them. Could you say some about that? Because I think the work is really incredible.
Yeah, well, let's just put it in context a little bit. What Rainbow History Project does is on the preserve and collect part of it, we collect things that you might typically associate with a history group, you know, paper archives of people's personal papers, organizational papers from media. We have in addition to this sound collection, this paper collection, which we have a wonderful partnership with the Historical Society of Washington. We collect and curate it and kind of give people a guide map, and the Historical Society of Washington makes it publicly accessible. And we're one of, if not the most requested collections from them. And we also have sound, film, and photo archives. A big part of our sound archives are oral histories. Get back to that in just one second, but also from a radio program in the city, Friends Radio, and TV. We do a lot of work out in the public. We do presentations as we often can. We've been a little hampered in 2020 like everybody else, but we're converting to all platforms like Zoom. We give walking tours that we've talked about. We're developing a new one right now on revamping our women's tour and updating it. We are really engaged in just everything we can do through our website to make things available and to make them available to researchers. And researcher is anybody who wants to know more. And we've worked with people in their dissertations and documentaries and with school programs from middle school at least through college. So I tend to be most associated with heading up and being an active oral history volunteer, which I find to be an absolute privilege to hear people's stories and have a chance to make sure that another generation of people gets to hear it. And with social geography, so kind of places and spaces and where gay culture has moved around Washington, DC, and also we have a guided Capitol Hill tour and a guided DuPont tour. So when we're back in real time again, we can safely gather, as we say, we will be doing that again. But we have some self-guided materials online.
Amazing, amazing. And it's
rainbowhistory.org.
rainbowhistory.org. Tyler, can we drop that in the chat just for folks to file that away? Thank you for that. It's actually it's the story part of the organization that I think really drew me to your work. And when you were listing the different kinds of communities or folks you've worked with, I didn't hear choreographer or dancer, but I know that that's part of your particular history. It's been a real treat over the last few years to get to know more about the organization and to specifically collaborate with you on some of those walking tours where we would bring folks out onto a kind of one of the guided tours that you run, but to partner an artist or dance artist with you so that we're both learning about the history in the places and spaces where it happened, but then also moving with that history through our body and synthesizing and connecting in different ways.
Yeah, you've been one of our best customers on our district tour. And I knew that you would handle making sure we got dance into this program. So I didn't feel that was on me.
Well, one of the things that's always struck me, Jeff, about the work we've done together and the stories that I've really gotten to hear more about through our work is, how prevalent movement and migration are a part of these experiences. And I think that's where I kind of want to start tonight is if you could just talk a little bit about the migration of queer communities within DC, because there's certainly a lot of that within our history, but then also the migration of queer people to DC.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I'm really glad that we're focusing on the storytelling aspect of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about specific names or places. That information is out there, certainly available through our website, but in other aspects. But I just sort of want to talk about some large things for all of us to think about when the other people on the panel are talking, because I think that will make it richer for all of us, I hope. So when I think about migration and relating it to LGBT DC, I think about why do people come? And more importantly, why do people stay? Secondly, I think about how do people move around the city in terms of social space? And then thirdly, I think about what are some prominently identified LGBT neighborhoods in the city. And to some extent, we are limited on our time, but sort of what's happened to some of those neighborhoods. Does DC have gay neighborhoods anymore? So just to start with, let's start about how people get here. I mean, I think there's this incredible myth, and if you live around here, you've heard it, that no one is from DC, everyone is here for someplace else. And that's actually pretty much debunked. It's really, you're not from here if you have a very small sample size of a very kind of distinctive group of people, because there are people who've been here for a very, very long time. But I think about when we think about why do people come here from someplace else, and I'm one of those people. Some people explicitly, like me, came here to have a gay life after growing up and going to college in small town America, which was fantastic. I really consciously wanted to have, and with intent to have, a gay life that I wasn't going to have. I wanted other things, but I wanted a gay life. But I think if we look at this story in DC, we really start with the New Deal. So in the 1930s, with the New Deal, there is a new sense of vision and of a relationship between the government and the lives of ordinary people, which means a difference in the size of what this government is. And so it needs more people to offer this. And then that's rapidly followed by World War II, which again is, it takes a massively larger group of people to administer a government. And while the government is everywhere across 50 states and also abroad through the State Department and the Foreign Service, the workforce is in DC, and it is, the largest employer. So when we think about the New Deal and World War II and the things that came out of that, I think it's a fun fact that from 1930 to 1950, the population of DC doubled. In 1950, and in the, DC was twice the size almost as it is now. So one, you just had the sheer fact of more people are coming to the city, and many of them are coming for employment. And many of them may go back to where they came from when this period of employment was over or winding down, or they didn't choose to continue it. But I think, the romantic in me thinks that some people stayed, that DC and being in a city offered them a life that they didn't have anywhere. And I would like to think that some part of that was the chance to be part of same-sex love, or to same-sex attraction, or to be part of an LGBT community. So you have sort of this swell in DC of population, and a lot of things roll out from that. So one is, you just have a lot of people living closer together. There was a massive need to create housing. So a lot of people were living in rooming houses or sharing apartments or sharing houses. And then in the area, especially in the earlier part of this, so let's just pick the 50s. It's a good place to start. It's a perfectly great place to talk about. There were a lot of gay bars that were both for men and for women in sort of that area, just sort of north of the mall, in the old commercial downtown of DC, so sort of Penn Quarter, Metro Center. And there were a lot of gay bars there. And an interesting note about gay bars is what we talk about as a gay bar was really a restaurant. There was sort of this prohibition hangover, for lack of a better, or for a great expression, about there was not what we would consider to be a bar in DC. And that has nothing to do with same sex, that was just a general prohibition. So a place that only sold alcohol. Bars, as we would talk about them, were restaurants that had strict rules about where you could stand and when you could stand and where you could sit and how moving around was done. So it was a very strong social construct of how people gravitated around bars, moved within bars even. So these were places that perhaps people went right after work, but then a certain group of people may have stayed and stayed and stayed. Some restaurants, and again, really just, it's okay to think of them as bars, but they were really, truly restaurants, had late licenses. There would be a limited number of places that, more people would gravitate to after hours. So they were largely, maybe some people didn't know who their clientele was, but they were probably largely sympathetic places. One point on that I would say is that, DC has been a large, a majority African-American population by number. I think that's getting, right around 50-50 these days. Lots of conversation about that. So any conversation about gay DC, any conversation about DC, so any conversation about LGBT, DC is a conversation about African-Americans. And thus it is a conversation, sadly, about segregation. And it's a conversation about segregation by law, and then overlaid with and continued by a segregation by social custom, as I think the only way, and learned behavior is the only way you can sort of talk about that. And I don't pretend that that is done now.
I'm glad you brought up the word by law, because one of the things that I've been thinking about, and it's kind of a thread that's surfaced a number of times in what you've already shared, with the New Deal and this kind of swell of people moving to DC specifically for work opportunities. When we look at Washington, we have to acknowledge that there is a really reciprocal relationship, I find, between what happens federally or on a national level and what happens locally on a community level. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's played out within the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, yeah. And certainly bars weren't the only way that people met, but you just had this denser population, and there's restaurants, and there's maybe church, movie theaters, all kinds of great stuff. So the relationship of the federal government and DC, and it's an interesting thing, with rainbow history, because we're really focused on DC history. We may be a little bit more interested in DC pride than the stories of the National Marches on Washington. We'll take both. If you have a story to tell, if you have something to give me, we'll take it, don't worry. But I think the thing that's important about the federal government is, although in governance, we are talking about a different beast than we are talking about the DC Council and DC law, but if for no other reason, not only to think about the federal government as a national influencer, it's the largest employer in DC. So anything that happened in the federal government was happening to people who lived on your block, who lived in your apartment building, who you socialized with. So you can't kind of tug apart what was happening in the federal government, especially around employment in the civil service, with the ordinary lives of a significant number of people who lived and worked in DC and in the nearby suburbs. And the federal government story for decades and decades and not completely over yet, is a story about work and a fight and an ongoing effort it's a civil rights story to demand equality in this of employment and protection of employment codified in federal civil service employment.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah.
But there's a lot of really, just like one thing, I think it's sort of interesting. Two things happened in the 40s and 50s that takes a long time to recover from. Is I think a lot of everybody on this call has heard about McCarthyism and the Red Scare and this terror that the communists had infiltrated the U.S. government and we were vulnerable. It is also runs on a parallel track with what has now sort of been referred to as the Lavender Scare, which is exactly the same thing, that there were these sort of massive amounts of homosexuals at work in the federal government that left the government vulnerable, especially in dealing with foreign governments, and again, ladling on this fear of the threat of communism around the world, and this idea that gays were vulnerable, LGBT people were vulnerable because they could be blackmailed because of their sexual identity. Somebody had not come quite across the idea that, well, if we just all came out and you were okay with us being out, you would sort of, turn down the volume on this problem. But so, this is even a 1953 executive order from Eisenhower that, sort of the moral, those guilty of moral, I hate air quotes, but of moral perversion needed to be purged from the government because they were a risk to the interests of national security. So this is a real battle, and thousands of people, nobody keeps track of the numbers, but thousands of people lost their jobs. And I think the other part of it that's just as poignant as people who lost their jobs was the people whose voices were silenced, who silenced themselves, and for good reasons, So, what's sort of how stunting that was beyond just employment.
Yeah. There's a lot that I want to dig into, and I also want to hold some time to hear from some of our other guests. So I want to ask one more
on the stage. This is
I mean, we could really be here all night and just have a cocktail and talk about all these things. But I do want to ask just one more question and see what comes up. When you think about local queer life, Jeff, historically and now, because history is being made every minute that we move forward. Is there anything else that we should know? Is there anything you'd want to share in kind of a brief way?
Yeah. I would swim back to the idea that I introduced because I think it's so important that the impact that DC being, the country, the DC is what we're talking about, being a segregated city, and that this does not end with laws that were passed in the 1950s or Supreme Court action about, who can eat in a restaurant in Washington, DC, who can shop in a department store. That doesn't get changed into the early 1950s. So the impact of that. And I think the other thing that I would say is that, LGBT people are not immune from all the other societal pressures that happen. So everything that we learn about race and culture, race and class and gender identity and all, it's not just this is falling down on us. We as LGBT people have generated and perpetuated this among ourselves. So, but segregation is the thing specifically for DC that I think is such an important thing to keep in mind about any conversation we have about interaction in history and space.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Like I said, I could really sit here all night and talk with you. And so I'm
I'm so
excited that we
excited to
have,
hear from other people. Yeah.
well, and I'm excited to have you come back in just a moment. So, so at this point, I think I'll just say goodbye for now. Um, and we'll see you in a bit. At this point, I do want to turn our attention to a number of local artists and organizers who have done so much to help shape some of DC's queer dance and art making communities. Jeff moments ago mentioned this tension or this relationship between or a question rather between why do people come to DC and why do people stay in DC, knowing that there are many people who are from this area, many people who come to this area to call this place home. So tonight's conversation, particularly as we dig into the dance and art making side of it, is really going to showcase and feature some of those folks who have long roots here, who are from this community, who have come to this community to call this community home. And I'm really thrilled to bring them forward. So in a moment, and I'm going to remind us if we can keep our mics on mute so that we can better hear those who are speaking, that would be great. Thank you in advance. So over the next bit of time, we'll have some opportunities to hear more specifics in relationship to the themes and ideas that Jeff spoke to. And we'll get to dive into DC queer dance from a number of angles, from DC's ball culture to dance and community engagement, to dance as one part of a multidisciplinary performance practice. And to help kick off the conversation, I'm going to invite one of our other speakers forward. Joining me now is the High Priestess of Love, the Queen of the Shameless Plug, the Empress of Pride, the Goddess of DC, the iconic, the legendary Rayceen Pendarvis. Rayceen, would you turn your camera on and join me? Hello.
Hello,
How
greetings and salutations.
how are you?
I am wonderful. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I have to say, it is a personal treat for me to have you with us tonight. I remember the first time I met you, and I think I've shared this story with you a few times, but I'm going to continue to share the story because it had such an impact on me. It was at one of the balls that you host at the HRC Equality Center. And that's actually one of the reasons that I wanted to chat with you tonight. It was sometime after that experience. You did make me walk the Butch Queen category. I will not let you live that one down. Um, that was a night. But after that experience, there was a moment where I was really excited to learn that DC has a really long and rich history of ball culture. And that was something that I didn't know when I first moved here, and certainly when I came and joined you at the HRC Center. So I want to dig into that. But first, for those tuning in tonight, I recognize that we might not all be familiar with ball culture, Rayceen. So could you tell us a bit more about what a ball is?
Oh my goodness, what a ball is. Well, first, let me say I'm a native Washingtonian and I am proud. I am a father of five, grandfather of two, and mother of many. And you spell my name Rayceen. And as the queen of the shameless plug and a host and an MC of the Ask Rayceen show, I invite everyone to follow me on all forms of social media, Please follow me at YouTube on the Team Rayceen channel, which is free. Like and subscribe. I suggest that. And please follow me on all forms of social media. And I do follow back. So please follow me, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those wonderful forms. And what a ball is, if for many who don't know, I am from the house of Pendarvis, founded by Avis Pendarvis, who was born and raised in Washington, D.C., moved to New York and took on a life and a legacy that was truly one of pride and joy. When you talk about balls, you talk about, I have to give you just a little bit of history. Balls came into prominence in the 1950s. If you would, for many historians can take it all the way back till the 1900s, when balls were held, kings and queens held balls. And of course you had the queens who always participated. And even up into slavery, during the point in doing slavery, they had balls, and many of the slaves who were slaves would dress up in drag and participate. And they had forms of ball as early as then. But if we talk about when did it become very big and prominent for many people, in the early 50s, balls were given by primarily transsexuals, due to the fact that many of them were not able to live their full and authentic selves in society. They created balls. Balls were safe places where those who were part of the LGBTQIA community could reign supreme, and especially the transgender community. They were able to be their full and fabulous self in the ballroom. So if you talk about New York, where balls were held, or if you would talk about in DC, they were held in prominent, in big cities, of course, Philly, Chicago, DC, Baltimore, New York, Atlanta. So you talk about the underground current of balls. So you talk about this underground world where our LGBTIAQ community primarily could really express who they were, because of society was not accepting them, society was not welcoming and inviting many of our trans people to live their full authentic self in society. So balls were created for them to reign supreme. And they usually were held late at night because everyone had a job. But so they would hold them at midnight, and they would go on to about like 8 in the morning. So it's like coming into Alice in Wonderland. So they created categories that allowed those to live and be fabulous and be glamorous. Categories like, at that time in the 50s, everyone wanted to look like movie stars. So the girls would give you Viva la Glamour, glitz and beads and sequins and rhinestones and feathers. They would look like Las Vegas showgirls or movie stars, Lena Horne, Marilyn Monroe, Dorothy Dandridge, Pearl Bailey, Marilyn Monroe, Jane Russell. They would give you elegance. And not to mention, not to exclude, allies would come. You didn't have to be part of our community to come. They would come, and they would have categories for real women, and real women would participate, and they would walk, female figure, female face, or beautiful girl in the ballroom, or they had categories for your lesbian community, best dom, best butch, super femme, for our lesbian community. And then as it moved through time, but before I go through that, let me just say, the better balls were always held in New York and DC and certain cities, but they would have, because we were still dealing with segregated. You had balls downtown and you had balls uptown. Right. And unfortunately, some balls did not allow those who were of those a part of the African community could not reign supreme fully. And if you see, it's a representation of very similar, if you watch the movie Queen, where Crystal LaBeija walks off the stage because she knew she should have won that night. But unfortunately, because we were dealing with the time and segregation, they wouldn't allow folks of color to really reign and live their full authentic self. So Crystal LaBeija who was a doll and one of the founders of the 4 houses, or what technically the 5 houses. You would have the House of Pendarvis, the House of LaBeija, the House of Dupree, the House of Extravaganza, the House of Corey. So those foundings were Dory Corey, Peppa LaBeija, and Crystal LaBeija, Paris Dupree, Avis Pendarvis, and Angie Extravaganza, which was a Latin house. So the girls or part of the Latinx community would reign supreme. And Angie Extravaganza started that house. And through those houses came so many more. So balls were a place where you could participate, you could walk, some of the girls would give you Pat Cleveland walk and Iman walk and give you face, and they would give you the girls. And then as time moves on, the Butch Queens came into providence. And then the Butch Queens came in, and Butch Queens and voguing. And voguing became big, and runway and model effect. And then the Butch Queens just blew and exploded on the scene of ballroom. And it's amazing because through ballroom came decades. Through the 70s, the Butch Queens were turning it. Then in the 80s, everybody wanted some. Everybody was coming to the ballrooms. Everybody. People started coming. Madonna, Jody Watley, Queen Latifah, Diana Ross. If you see it in the videos, and let me be clear, before Madonna's Vogue, there was Liz Torres, there was Jody Watley, there was Queen Latifah, Diana Ross. Even in one of her videos, This House, the Kids Are Voguing Down. So Madonna, bless her heart, I love her. I think she's amazing. I think she's fabulous. And I think she's wonderful. But she was not the only one to bring Vogue to mainstream. It was other folks who latched onto it first. So then it became big in the 80s. Everybody wanted something. Everybody would come to the ball. I mean, celebrities. And then when Avis sat down with Susan Barsh and he created the Life Ball, which the Life Ball is now the Latex Ball. The Life Ball and the Love Ball was a big ball that they held. And they brought in the best of Broadway, Godfrey Holden, Gwen Verney, and then they brought the fashion industry, Iman, Pat Cleveland. All of them came from the fashion industry and came and were celebrity judges. So they judged and you could get to compete. So folks had to participate and to register early, and then they would compete on a night where Broadway and fashion and music all came together, and ballroom all in one night. So that was a really big, wonderful thing. So that was amazing and so ahead of its time. Yeah. And it was raising money because at the time, many of the ballroom community was being affected, as we all were, with HIV and AIDS. So it raised money and it raised awareness. And now, here we are, years later, you have Paris is Burning. Because of Paris is Burning, you have Pose, you have so many other wonderful, wonderful, amazing films. So and amazing, I'm so proud to see Pose. Pose is breaking ground on so many levels. You know, it is the first ever to have fully employed 250 members of the LGBT community, from screenwriting to directing to actors, all part of the LGBTQIA experience. So it's because of ballroom, you have all of those. You have all the other things that come into point, and people research and do the research if you want to know about ballroom. You think about someone who I love dearly, Tracy Africa, who, because of her, she broke ground. She was one of the first transgender models to secure a fashion contract, a modeling contract, a color. She was the color. She was Clorox on the Clorox bottle, and then 40 years later, Clorox brought her back. And here she is, 40 years later, on the Clorox box again. So you talk about how ballroom and how people maneuvered into all of these wonderful legacies of ballroom, and it's because of that. So I gave you a little bit about what is a ball, but I also gave you a little bit of a history of where balls come from. So in order to know what it is, you got to know where it began and where it's going.
And we love you for that, Rayceen. We love you for that. Thank you. And it's really, really striking to me just how how much history and how much um, kind of stewardship of ball culture you know and hold, and how much it means to you. I mean, and one of the things that really like moved me was, because of ballroom, we have all of these different things that are happening now. 250 LGBTQIA plus people are employed on a mainstream television show. That's incredible.
And
Um,
HBO has legacy, legendary, legacy, legend. Look at
mhm,
that. They have a
mhm.
whole show on HBO all around ballroom. So kudos.
Well, and it's clear that it also really has shaped so much of your life, and you shaped so much of ball culture, especially here in DC. And so, that's one thing I'd also love to hear you talk a little bit about too, is just your experience within DC's ball culture. And when I think about ball culture now here, I can't help but think about Rayceen. So I'd love to hear a little bit too about why did you choose to continue this legacy of ball culture? What moved you to start hosting yours?
Well, it's homage and paying homage to those who are not here and keeping the legacy and bringing the new millennials into the fold and allowing them to have a place in a safe space. Having my annual ball is a safe space. And sometimes balls are not always fair, and sometimes they're not always nice, and sometimes you don't always win. But in my place that I create, in my space, everybody's a winner. So I make you feel as if even though you did not take home a trophy, you still shine and are a queen or king
Mm.
for the night. So keeping that legacy means a lot to me, and it honors those who are part of who are now my ancestors in the ballroom community. And it's not about what house you belong to. It's about you come and you compete and you have a good time.
Mhm.
And life, no one's always going to win in life, but in the ballroom, it teaches you, it tells you to roll your sleeves up and get prepared. Life is sometimes going to throw you a chop and be prepared to win anyway.
Yes.
So when you get chopped in life, the ballroom prepares you to say, well, I got chopped. The ball must go on. So you pick your face up and continue to march through. So when you think about balls in DC, I think about so many places. I think of about one of the biggest balls that they held. At, it was at the time at the which is now the 930 Club, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't the 930 Club then. It was something else then.
Mm-hmm.
WST. It was a radio station,
Mm.
and then it became a event hall. So the kids had a big ball there. They had a ball. Oh my God! At the old convention center outside. So I mean, the kids at ballroom has the House of Allure was started here in
Mm.
DC.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think about the House of Khan, the House of West. I think about all these amazing the House of Grisson, Shannon
Mm-hmm.
Grisson in his house. The House of Balenciaga has house members here. And I think about how each chapter has members and chapters in every city. So ballroom in DC is amazing. They have balls all the time in DC. Of course, we can't have it because of COVID-19 restrictions,
Right.
but the kids have, oh, when they comes back into full force, they're going to have balls every month.
Mm.
Balls should be held 4 times a year, 4 times a year
Mm.
in each city. And now they have them every weekend. Every weekend somebody's having a ball. I mean, balls everywhere, and there's mini balls. And this is how
Mhm.
it goes. A kiki ball is on a smaller level. You don't have to really belong to a house to participate. So
Okay.
you go, you kind of get your feet wet, feel like, oh, I could try this. Then you come to a mini ball. And then you come to a mini ball because it's not going to have that many categories and you're not going to be leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it prepares you for everything. And then you go to the major ball.
Mm.
The major balls would go on sometimes still to like 10 in the morning because many of the kids, they work at nightclubs. So they have lives and they have children and they put the kids to sleep and come to the ball at 12 at midnight. So the kids do work and so don't think, from contrary to what you hear. Some people like to focus on the negative, but there's a
Right.
lot of good.
Right.
They have college funds raised, like the House of Grassant, the House of Balenciaga, the House of Pendarvis, the House of Khan, the House of Allure. Everybody gets together in DC and throws different things and
Mhm.
raise money for different causes and
Right.
charities.
Right.
Charities for like the House of Ruth, the Casa Ruby or HBCs. So a lot of these kids in these houses are doing things. I feel like because myself and the House of Pendarvis, we have moved into activism. We've moved into uh, pageantry. You know, we have chapters all over in Vegas. Desiree Pendarvis is the mother. Tanae Pendarvis is the mother in New York. Jamal is the father in Atlanta. And I am one of the elders of the tribe in DC, and Saul and Freddie are in New York. So we have chapters all over Chicago, Philly. So, and we are doing so many things on the level around activism, mental health, addiction, homelessness. So we've taken our ballroom more into it's spread it and it's grown, and it's about helping and building the LGBT community. Because if we talk about all lives matter, LGBT lives matter, ballroom, trans lives matter, trans men matter, those who are non-gender conforming. And in the ballroom, it is teaching us, and it's also some of the kids, what I love about it, some of the kids have a scholarship and are connected with Duke Ellington. So part of the arts, they allow these kids to come to the ball and participate, and then they help them go to other levels in their career of fashion, dance, music, all of that. So they are always showcasing a level of the arts and how that springboards all of these creative people to go into areas of fashion, designing, costuming, directing, filming. So I'm so happy that when I go places and I see people, and I walk into a film a lot, and I see some of the kids from ballroom, and they come over, oh, Rayceen, oh my God. I was like, oh, look at you, what are you doing? And they're now telling me they're writing and they're directing and all of that because they got their teeth wet on the ballroom floor.
Well, they got their teeth wet, and then they also had that sense of community and that sense of family to support and connect and cultivate and then send them off. So thank you for that. You mentioned you get chopped on the ballroom floor. I think that's what happened to me when I had to walk in your mini ball those years ago. I'll have to try again sometime.
Yes, try again. You may have got chopped, but you were still serving.
Well, thank you. Rayceen, it's always such a delight to talk with you. And again, I'm really, really thrilled and honored you're here tonight, and excited to have you come back in just a moment. And thank you for sharing all that you've shared about ballroom culture. It's a gem and a real treasure here in DC.
Thank you. An honor, and everyone. I'll be back.
And we'll see you in just a minute. Thank you, Rayceen. So you can go ahead and turn your camera and mic off. And I'm going to go ahead and invite our next speaker forward. Peter DiMuro, could you turn your camera and mic on? Hi, Peter.
Apparently I can. Who knew?
You can. You did it. Hey, everyone. So this is Peter. Peter DiMuro has woven a career as a dancer, actor, choreographer, director, teacher, facilitator of creative practice, and an arts engager. He's currently the executive artistic director of the Dance Complex in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and continues creating his work through the creative umbrella of Peter DiMuro Public Displays in Motion, which I have the real treat to sometimes collaborate and partner with. From 2003 to 2008, Peter was the artistic director of the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange here in DC, capping a 15-year relationship as a performer and lead artist with the company. It's great to have you here, friend.
It's nice to be here. Thank you so much.
I know that we've been trying to do this for, I don't know, what feels like years now.
Well, you just got to put on a Zoom and pour a drink, and here we are.
So for those tuning in tonight, I feel like it's important to say that for me, Peter has been a real mentor and thinking partner for so much of the work that I do, and has been a part of many, 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 many conversations and collaborations that have shaped where my art making is today. So first, I want to say thank you again for that, Peter. What's that?
I said the feeling's mutual. I learn every time we chat. It's an exchange. It's certainly not, a doddering old man.
Well, and that word exchange, so we both were artists with the Dance Exchange at different times. And when I found out about you and your work, it really offered something for me to respond to and connect with, and and specifically, I'm talking about your work with LGBTQ plus people and experiences through the community engaged dances that you make. So when I started making my own work, I mean, it really felt like I was picking up a kind of mantle and building on a legacy, which was just a remarkable gift for me. Um, and it's been a joy to kind of stay connected to you now in the work you're doing. And so my question for you then, Peter, is if you could tell us a little bit about those early days of making work with queer folks here in DC, and what did that look like?
Sure, sure. I do want to say, just preface that by saying two things. One, thank you for inviting me, because I know I'm technically not of DC anymore. I'm of the world, as we, those of us who've toured any for work, but based in Boston. And when we give homage to the Massachusetts tribe, that I'm broadcasting from those lands, but I'm also broadcasting from across the street from Jacques Cabaret, which some of our viewers might know if they've been around, a gay club forever since the 20s, but definitely a drag club from the 70s on. And then down the street is the old site of the Napoleon Club, which is rumored to have hosted Judy Garland and JFK in his Harvard days. And it was I'm going to use the term, it's not very politically correct, but the term wrinkle room. And it was a club for older men who gathered around pianos mostly, and stars of Broadway would come by into. So I'm in three ancestral lands at this moment. The work then, boy, we've seen such changes in what it means to be have an identity in the art world, right? And in the 80s, when I was first starting to make work in Boston and just about to move to DC to work with Liz, it was a time when we were making work about AIDS, and I was performing as myself for the first time. Which I didn't realize was a big deal at all, but it was, putting the story of AIDS on stage, my life on stage. I come from rural Illinois and town of 150 people, where my father was chief of police, and I was just doing what I saw other people do, put their lives on stage. So I'm going to do this too. And when I got to DC and started working with Liz. And to, God bless her. I mean, there were several of us who came in to the company gay. We turned gay as soon as we got there, right? And we had been gay, and Liz wanted to really push forward our whole identity as individuals of the 10 or so in the company. It was intergenerational at the time, very thoroughly. And so I said, well, she allowed space for me to create a couple of programs. One was called Near, Far, In, Out, which we created locally at Clarice Smith when it first opened. And also some of the work had had seeds in workshops at Whitman Walker, where I was working with both caregivers and those directly having AIDS. And I think that's actually where kind of the seeds of this came to be. I said, well, if I work intergenerationally in this quote unquote straight world or this mixed world, why can't I do this among intergenerations within the LGBTQ community? And which is what we didn't have the extra vowels and pluses at the end of that at that time. So so I feel like it was truly a time when we were illuminating stories of real everyday people. And it's so fascinating to hear about the balls and kind of revisit that. We tended to find like this odd hodgepodge of people, ages, from their teens all the way to their 80s or 90s, working and creating dances, yes, but mostly stories that moved. I think was the thing. In one instance, one of the productions that was in Tampa, not DC, but it was the first time that I had encountered in one production, we had a 50-something male to female transsexual who had served in Vietnam as a man, but was a woman by the time she had done the project with us. And in the same production, someone who had just transitioned, just had their breasts removed, and a 21, 22 something, who's now a minister in the Episcopal Church, and who I still see on Facebook every now and then. And then there was the straight jock boyfriend of the dancer girl in town who wanted to do the project, and so there was this odd, almost I don't want to say, it was like utopian world of straight and gay and queer all mixed together. And it would look so naive by today's standards, I know, but it was a first for us in those ways. So DC, I feel like there was this straddling of both the kind of international city, the international presence, which was very cosmopolitan, and the idea of being informed by queer life, probably ahead of its time through parts of the world that were very much more progressive than the United States, and more progressive than DC as a southern city, I would say. I hope that doesn't offend anybody, but coming from Chicago originally, it felt very southern city, kind of rooted in especially local, very much church-going kind of struggle to come out sometimes, but then you had, of course, the houses, and Rayceen talked so beautifully about. So we straddled those worlds quite a bit during that time, and then we travel around the country and then come home, and it was allowing a picture of this life evolving in the gay to queer world that I found fascinating, and because we were moving so fast, I don't think I realized what we were doing until 10 years later.
Right. Well, and you mentioned that word evolving. You bring in that word evolving, Peter, and I know that your work has evolved over time, but there's, I feel, been a kind of commitment to continue to center LGBTQ plus voices and experiences. Maybe not necessarily through all of the work, although I might argue that because of the performing you and the kind of supporting everybody showing up as their individual unique self, I might argue that actually all of your work does continue to center and celebrate queer people. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about how those early experiences set you up for what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, yeah, and I feel like there's we all evolve. Hopefully, we all evolve. And as an artist, I have acquaintances and friends who, and I'm guilty of it too, make the same work that you might have made 10, 15 years ago. And it's, those of us lucky enough and privileged enough to be working in the arts. Sometimes, it's like I'll go to a college and I'll kind of repeat myself, but on the whole, I feel like I am, it's so boring to stay the same. And the world isn't the same. And I'm 61. Who the heck knew that would ever happen, especially growing up, coming up at a time when a lot of my friends were dying, especially in the arts. And so I think that's probably why I continue to not be satisfied with staying the same. And the world has not stayed the same. And from 1999, 2000, when we were doing this early work, to now, I'm more recently in a project that was inspired by an intergenerational conversation. And I was in rehearsal. I'd been commissioned to make a work for the memorial service of a man slightly older than me. He died in his 70s a day after he had been to a Parkinson's dance class, actually down the street from here. And he was the editor of arts editor of Bay Windows, and I'd written for him when I was still here. And in rehearsal, two younger members, one in their 20s, one in their 30s, say, "What was AIDS like?" You lived it. And meaning the height of the crisis, and it was like I was my father, and I was talking about World War II. It was like I had blocked so much shit, out of that experience that I the conversation ensued for about an hour, and we talked about things that I didn't know about the transition from over many years although it's been present all these years, the spectrum of people who are queer. But for some of us generationally, that's very new. And I have friends my age who are confused. I'm confused sometimes, about the correct way to address folks and be sensitive to people's needs. And so because of that, I feel like the current project I'm working on, called Stones to Rainbows, Gay to Queer Lives, is evolving, and I get to pull out and I'm still me, I'm still directing, but it's a product of this time, that it's not important for me to tell my story as much as to use my experience to create a platform for others to tell theirs. And it's daunting at times, but it's also freeing, in the sense that I feel liberated to just listen and use my choreographic skill or directing skill to pull up and out things that might need to be. But I'm also letting go of my postmodern aesthetic. Who the hell told me I was a boss 20 years ago, or any of us? And we were doing the best we could within constructs of taking people's stories with their permission and putting them on stage in these kind of postmodern tools. Well, we're going to do an accumulation phrase with you, and we're going to set you people in a grid, and you can tell your story when the spotlight hits you. And it reeks of patriarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so why not be in a world today where the art changes and I get to change my role with it, and all of a sudden it's like I need to do less and just listen more. And so again, it's freeing, and it's also makes you nervous at the same time. But I'm really excited about this shift.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Peter. This conversation is so rich and wonderful, and it's great to have you here. I think one of the silver linings, actually, of the work we have to do online right now, it's like you're in my living room, even though we're miles apart. So at this point, I think I'm gonna, for sake of time, move us to our next guest, but I know that we'll be back with you in just a moment. So I'll go ahead and invite you to turn your camera and mic off. And I will invite Lady Dane Figueroa Edidi to turn her mic on and camera on. Hey, girl.
Hey, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you?
I'm good, child. I'm good. I'm a sleepy boots, honey. I need to try to go to sleep early tonight, honey, because
You and me both. You and me both. I will join you in going to bed early. But before we do that, I want to make sure people know who you are, because you are so fabulous. And I know I said this the other night, but I am such a fangirl. Truly. So dubbed the ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa, Lady Dane Figueroa Edidi is a Nigerian, Cuban, indigenous, American performance artist. She is a Helen Hayes award-winning playwright and a Helen Hayes nominated actress and choreographer, and the first trans woman of color to be nominated for these awards. She is an educator, speechwriter, author, and the first trans woman of color in DC to publish a work of fiction. Lady Dane is a founding member of Forced Collision and the founder of the Inanna D Initiatives, which curates, produces, and cultivates events and initiatives designed to center and celebrate the work of transgender nonconforming artists of color. She is the co-editor of the Black Trans Prayer Book, and you can find her work on stages, podcasts, online, and on web series, and in print, and basically anything Matthew Cumbie does from here on out. So it is such a great pleasure to have you here. For those that tuned in earlier this year in the summer, Lady Dane was with us then, and I know that I'm not alone when I say that talking with you this summer was such a gift, and it left me with so many more questions and so many more thoughts, which is one of the reasons why I was really excited for this opportunity to bring you back. And one of the first things that really struck me about our first meeting, I think it was at a poetry event, actually, where my partner brought me to up in Columbia Heights.
It was Capturing Fire, I think.
It might have been part of Capturing Fire. Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I think it might have been Alchemy, which was a event that I co-produced. Yeah.
Yes.
And I created. Yeah.
Yes, you were very much in the producing role that day. But one of the things that struck me, my friend, and one of the things that feels so incredibly important about your work is how you center trans women, and especially Black trans women and trans women of color. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you tonight is if you could talk a little bit about your commitment to telling these stories of Black trans women and trans women of color.
Yeah, I mean, trans women are divine, honey. Black trans women are amazing. Every piece of culture, every piece of, artistic brilliance, it can be traced back to a Black trans woman, honey, a Black or Indigenous trans woman. And so, yeah, I think, this is the thing, is that part of the work that I do is centered on healing. Part of the work that I do is centered on the word that's coming to me now is cultural memory. Part of the work that I do is, holding the mirror to audiences. And I think that so often within, I was born in the 80s, and so
Same, girl, same.
I remember, I know Black don't crack, baby. And so I remember being at the apartment, and there were these amazing Black trans women who were in the apartment, and then the next day they disappeared, right? And how there was a whole generation, and because I'm from Baltimore originally, there was a whole generation of Black and brown trans women who became ancestors, which and I think too soon, right? I think because the government really didn't care about LGBTQ people during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And so thinking about the fact that, I come from a family of artists, and my aunt Liz, who was an artist, an academic, and an advocate, she would put books in front of me and say, you're probably not going to get all the education that you need to get about who you are, about your purpose, etc., from school, right? From a white institution. And so it was always important for me to not only be curious about the history of myself and my family. And when I say myself, I mean the identities that I hold, right? Black, Indigenous, Cuban, trans woman. And so because of that, I witnessed, as I grew up through the arts, this erasure of trans women. And many times it was on purpose, right? And in DC, specifically as we talk about legislation, I know y'all were talking a little bit about that earlier, that intersection between legislation, the art, and the government here in DC, and how those two marry sometimes, the politics and the artistic. And that there was also a time where cis gay men, primarily white, intentionally erased trans women, particularly Black and brown, Indigenous trans women, from spaces where where Black and Indigenous trans women were actually doing all the groundwork and had laid the foundation, right, for what is called gay rights. And that these men, when they got a little bit of access and had a chance to be able to pass, for example, marriage equality, they forgot about these women and purposefully ignored them. And so that was my long way of saying that, one, I deserve to see myself reflected on stage, on the stages that when I go to see a show, I deserve to see myself reflected. In my community reflected. That's number one. Number two, as a priestess, as a healer, as a historian, as a woman, as a Black woman, as an Indigenous woman, as a Latinx woman, as a trans woman, it is important for me in utilizing my artistic gift to celebrate, center, acknowledge us, and to invite us to remember who we are, which are divine people. So because in the spirit of resistance, in the spirit of resistance, in the spirit of resisting white supremacy and colonization, that remembering is directly linked to liberation.
I'm writing that down because that is beautifully said, beautifully said. Well, and one of these, you know, thinking about this remembering and this cultural memory that you've called in tonight, I know that, you know, you said you're from Baltimore, so you have a long history here in the region and in DC specifically, working in these different artistic communities. And I guess one of the things that I'm wondering about is how have you seen space and support for trans women and trans artists? How has that changed or not?
Oh gosh, this is such a heavy question. Heavy. Even though I know that that's not what that's about. Actually, I shouldn't be singing that. That song is totally fatphobic. It's from Dreamgirls. It's, you know, it's okay. So okay. So, okay. I will say this. When I was younger, right? So often, the ways in which representation happened, particularly around like trans people. Oh, sorry, y'all. Let me get some water. Gotta meet your needs. I'll use some hand sanitizer. I'm gonna be done with this interview. Is that the representation was not great. If you did have a trans person in something, the way that they were represented was either as the villain, as someone who was confused, and really, really, really did a lot of harm in educating society about who we are. And I think that once Laverne Cox, right, like there, you know, there were trans performers before Laverne Cox, and there will be trans performers after Laverne Cox, right? But there was something about where the country was, her presence on Orange is the New Black, that did something, right? And then there was this idea of this trans tipping point. And I think that DC was a part of that, right? Like there were DC theaters now who were, you know, using fake allyship, operating under fake allyship, right? Who were looking for plays that had trans characters in them. Now, part of why I say the fake allyship part is that they did not move with intentionality and integrity, which means that they were actually they were either commissioning and or programming pieces that had trans characters in them, but cisgendered people were playing them. And oftentimes they had cisgendered men playing trans women, which we know is, oh, can I cuss? I probably can't. Which we know is—
Say whatever you want. Say whatever you want.
Which we know is fucked up.
Yes.
And it's transphobic. They oftentimes would program pieces that may have had trans characters, but they were written by cis people. Cis people who had no kind of understanding about who we were as trans folks. And they also, you know, it was trauma porn, it was misrepresentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And do I think that DC artistically has, I'll use this term, but this isn't what I mean, made room for more trans artists? No. No. I don't think that it has. I think that DC, the thing about, oh gosh, okay, let me try to, because I know it's like, okay, let me, okay, this is the thing about DC is that we have to understand that we are living on colonized lands, and that our system is rooted in white supremacy, meaning the governmental system, and that if we are to have true conversations about dismantling internalized and systematic white supremacy, or, you know, this idea of quote unquote racial reconciliation, at the heart of that work must be the truth.
Yep.
And
Yep.
at the heart of that work must be the space for Black and Indigenous people to name how white people have harmed them and how white people are actually benefiting from oppressive systems that are still harming us. And so when you're talking about the theater, right, or you're talking about the arts, and you're talking about that within DC, where the politics of white supremacy is insidious. You might not necessarily see somebody wearing a hood, but you'll see somebody who's voting against your right to be able to get married or to live or to survive, and smiling in your face and expecting for you not to say nothing about it. And that these theaters and sometimes these artistic entities, in order to keep funding or in order to keep a certain demographic of audience, they actually play the game of white supremacy in a way that sometimes is detrimental to the actual lives of Black and Indigenous and brown trans people.
And that's
so
the tea.
That is how I feel about that.
Yeah, that's the tea. That's the tea. Ooh, there's some stuff to dig into there. And I think rather than doing that alone, I actually maybe want to invite some of our friends to join us. So thank you, Lady Dane, for all of that. I'm going to invite you to stick around, actually. And at this point, I'm going to also invite Jeff and Rayceen and Peter to turn your cameras and mics on and join us. Beautiful. Welcome, friends. So, you know, we were just starting to really, I think, scratch on this. There's this really interesting, what I feel to be tension right now, but maybe there's another word for it. But something I'm feeling around this performative allyship that you're speaking to, Lady Dane, but also like this. From what we've heard tonight, lots of other ways that I think activism or activating and organizing live in the artwork that we're talking about too. So, and that's one of the reasons I think I was really interested to bring this group together tonight. Kind of in preparation, Jeff and I had a conversation maybe a week ago, and I was talking about, I think, a little bit how I see like an amplification of art making allied with activism or organizing in DC, whether that's performative or not, right? But it feels really amplified here in our community. And Jeffrey phrased it in such a lovely and succinct way. He said, in DC, we are a people with a purpose. Whether we're true and honest and heartfelt about that purpose is, I think, a different question. But we are a people with a purpose. And I feel like that's really interesting because when I think about each of the work that y'all do, I feel that purpose-driven, bringing people together to celebrate community, to build community, to cultivate community through the arts, through art making. I feel that heart is actually in this room with each of you. And so as a kind of like crosstalk moment, a group conversation, I just want to pose one question before we start to open it up a little bit to our friends tuning in. I'd love to hear a little bit about what moves y'all to make the work you do. And I'm really specifically interested in why do you do that through dancing or dance making or live performance? What is it about that feels essential to the work you make and the activation that you try to inspire or move forward?
I think live art is connected to ancestral practice of ritual, right? I think that before there was the American theater, there was the European theater, and before there was the European theater, there was the Asian theater, and before there was the Asian theater, there was the African theater, and before there was African theater, there was African ritual. And so, for myself, I think that relationship of in-person, that relationship of the mirror, it hits a little bit different when you're in person. It hits a little bit different. And I think that you form a certain type of relationship for however long that artistic ritual is happening together. And that the minute that folks sit down in their seats, they have made a contract to actually go on that journey with you. And so, yeah. So, I also want to shout out my auntie Rayceen. Because if you don't know, she has been so amazing for Black and Brown and Indigenous trans artists in DC. And shout out to Angel Rose Arts Collective, who is a trans theater company in DC. So yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And
Rayceen, yeah.
And to add to that, I think when we talk about art, we have to talk about the importance of telling our stories and why our stories matter.
Right.
The moment you are able to tell authentically a story, a journey, a vision of an experience of the LGBTQI in its full, rich, complex, divine, but when it's authentic, whether it's through dance, music, theater, film, but when it allows someone to sit, listen, and hear, and to begin to understand the experience of the human being is one of love. And love and acceptance is powerful. And when you are telling authentic stories, it begins to resonate in the person who is watching and hearing. And then they see themselves in that thread of the fabric of this authentic person, whether they are straight or a non-believer. But when they see the experience of love, it begins to bring us together. And it binds us.
Oh, you just did, Rayceen, what I was gonna, you both spoke so beautifully. You did this gesture like this right around your finger, it combines us together. And it's the multiple languages that live performance, that movement and words come together to do, right? So I could talk to you till I'm blue in the face and you might not understand, or you could see this that you just did and you might understand better. And it's exactly why, in 1985, when I was making the work about AIDS, I made the choice that this work has to have American Sign Language, it has to have the spoken word, and it has to have dance involved with it, because I knew I didn't want people to mistake this loss of love or life for anything else but for what it really was. And it had to have that specificity. So I'm so inspired by you two, I want to cry, but I'm sorry. I'm not sorry.
And we are with you, so that the feeling is mutual.
Thank you.
And I think it's about, Rayceen was talking about authenticity. And I think that's such a marvelous word. And that, I'm one of those people who, for better or for worse, a lot of times feels more alive in a theater, watching and in my own way participating in live performance, than I can feel in other places. And what that says about my life, we can pick that apart some other day, but it's a time to feel really alive and to feel really authentic. And one of the things I think why, professionally I'm a writer, so storytelling has always meant something to me, and history is about storytelling, and the work that the people I'm privileged to be on this panel is a form of storytelling. But that when I think about the part of it that I bring is about the history, is this idea of who's in the history books and who isn't, and who gets written out of the story. And the idea when I'm sort of talking about the government of, our ancestors, and still today, but, were silenced and sometimes had to silence themselves. And I appreciate that because they needed to make their way in the world. And so, I feel I do have an ancestry that I'm responsible to, and I feel that, I have an obligation to participate in using my voice or other people using their voices.
Y'all are gonna make me cry up on this conversation tonight. Thank you. I'm looking at the time and I want to honor folks' time. So I want to actually take just a few more minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and invite at this point anybody who is willing and wanting and able to turn your camera on and join us, so we can open up the floor for a bit more conversation and questions. If anybody's got a question that they'd like to ask our panelists, our speakers, please feel free. But so this is that time, if you want to go ahead and turn your video on, just so we can also get a sense of who's on the call with us. I'll give us a moment. Here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I have a feeling we're going to have a few screens to scroll to. Just a reminder, if you would like the support of ASL interpretation, you can always also scroll your mouse over the 3 dots of our interpreters and pin their video so that you see that. But beautiful. Welcome, everybody. So while we're here, I just want to go ahead and open the floor up, knowing that there also might be some folks whose videos, who are not turning on their videos. So you can also always use the raise your hand feature that I'm about to walk us through. So if you have a question for one of our panelists, there's a couple of ways to get my attention that I'd like to practice really quickly right now. One, you could always like lean in as a way to indicate you're interested. Can we try that together right now? So go ahead and just lean in a little closer. Find some way to bring yourself closer to that camera. I see nice smiles and foreheads and eyeballs. Beautiful. Let's bring that back. That's one way to get my attention. Another way to get my attention is to raise your hand. Let's try that right now. Go ahead and just raise one part of your body. It could be a hand, an arm, a shoulder, a finger, right? Beautiful. And let's bring that back. Just for good measure, let's do the other side so we're evened out. Yeah? Look at that. Who knew we'd be dancing tonight? Who knew? And bring that back. All right, great. And then, of course, there's always the raise hand feature, which I think you can find under, yes, if you go to participants, that's a lie. Don't listen to me. There is a raise hand feature in the box below on the chat. You can find that. And you can also just drop your question in the chat box too. So yeah, really quickly, we'll take a moment to hear who's got some questions, who wants to know a little bit more from some of our panelists. And I will scroll. I see Kat McGuire. What would you like to know, friend? Can you unmute yourself and dive in?
I actually just wanted to say that I'm so grateful for this. This has been so important for me. I'm really trying to embrace the journey of learning more, understanding more, addressing my own systemic racism and bias that I didn't even know I had, being a 59-year-old white woman of privilege. And this has been just extraordinary for me to have an opportunity to really listen, examine, think about, and participate in a future that I hope supports all of us. Thank you all. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Kat. Keith Fleming, would you go ahead and unmute yourself? What do you want to know more about?
Well, it's really interesting to hear people talk about the art they made during AIDS and relating that pandemic to, which wasn't really identified as a pandemic then, right, to our current pandemic and art making. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember a lot of the art made by the community. And one of the things that was the most impressive to me about it was the greatest art was about love. It was about the love that people had and the caretaking that they were doing for people who were dying. And it was really, truly profound. And now I'm seeing that same kind of profound thing in the whole world about people who can't take care of their loved ones who are dying and stuff like that, but you know, who their heart goes out to that. And so I'd like to ask the older folks in the panel if that was also their experience. I mean, I've been working with dancers for 45 years, and so a lot of my friends and art makers and stuff like that were people who were making art in that era. And so, you know, I'd kind of like to ask them, you know, what they see as the parallels and the differences.
So the question is really about their experience. Could you talk about your experience between what was happening artistically during the AIDS epidemic and now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Rayceen, why don't you dive on in, honey?
Well, you know, someone who's lived through all of that to now, you know, speaking of being a certain age, I just turned 70 this year, so I'm very proud. I've seen a lot of things. So, and I'm still here. And I think I remember we're talking about ballroom, or if you're talking about being LGBT or talking about trans women who were on the front line. trans women were raising money and awareness before it was fashionable. If it was not for Black trans women, Latin trans women, Asian trans women, all, and trans men who were on the front line before. I remember when we didn't have Whitman Walker, when we didn't have organizations, when there was no HRC, there was none of that existed. And folks were, I remember when they formed Transgender Health Empowerment, and before there was nothing. Folks used their arts. They came together, they created, and then when you talk about art, when it started hitting so many of my friends in the theater world, oh my God, you think about, and here I am 30 years, I applaud Sherry Lee Ralph for Diva Simply Singing, when she got everybody in the theater world together, and folks were raising money, and she called and everyone was saying yes, yes, what could we do? I mean, the theater world just rallied around and created such a power within, and they were healing and doing the work when there was no organizations doing it. They pulled together, and the trans community pulled together, the drag community pulled together, the LGBTQIA community pulled together. We pulled together and we used whatever we get. People used their own money. People opened their doors because families were not accepting them. Families were turning them out and just had nothing to do. I remember putting on hazmat suits like you have to put on now to go through double doors into hospitals. So we did it. We created our own community through call lines and phone calls and letters and raising money, whatever it was, change, dollars, whatever we could do, we were raising it. And then out of that came these organizations. Folks, I remember when the call came down in the clubhouse, in the nightclub, when they had ICANN, Inner City AIDS Network, which became Us Helping Us. Then the National Minority AIDS Council, then all these other stuff started coming. Whitman Walker blew up. When Whitman Walker, I remember when kids would go to Whitman Walker and some kids wouldn't walk through the front door. They would come through the back door because they didn't want people to see them coming through the front door because of the stigma attached to that. But the art community, when you think about all of them, these brave people using what I remember, they had street theater and all of this stuff that is no more. And oh God, Mike Malone and Peggy Cooper Caper coming out of Duke Ellington, and all of these wonderful folks who came out, and all these street theaters and all these amazing creative people in DC, and these creative forces and these creative lights who connected with the folks at Howard University, and Debbie and Felicia and all of those amazing women and all those amazing alumni who were pulling together, not even asking to say, well, don't put our name on anything. Don't tell people we're doing this. We're just going to help raise money. We're going to send money this way because some of our children who are all these lights in the theater world who are dying, but we don't need to be honored. We don't need to do this. We're just going to do it because it had to be done. And then they were connecting with the trans community. I think about looking around in a room and I would see like Debbie Allen, Felicia Rashad, Sparkle LaBelle, Ella Fitzgerald, everybody in Capital Pride, Black Pride, all of those things about not having money, but these kids pulled together and made before NBC and ABC and CBS and all those folks who decided, oh, let me jump on a bandwagon and give you some money because it's now fashionable. It was the folks, Robert York and all of those people in rooms and back rooms and libraries raising money, gay men getting together in a room, setting aside all the bullshit and all the rhetoric and not dealing with the fact that you might not like me, you may not honor me, you may not appreciate me, you might not even really fuck with me. Let me be clear. And then we sat aside and had to get through the racism and the sexism and the homophobia and the transphobia. Sit at the table with everybody and say, look, my son is dying, my sister's dying. And then someone at the table saying, I'm living with it. And I'm fearful of what may happen in the end. But we've got to come together and start doing the work. And the art community was the first when the call came that just jumped with it. They just said, yes, what can we do? And they created, and they're still creating. I think about how the Broadway community is getting together in this pandemic. And I'm looking at Broadway stars doing so much and having these sing-alongs and these virtual, and they, at first, early on, everybody was shook. The art community was shook. Nobody knew what to do. We were stunned Because here we didn't think in October, going into November, going into December, that we will be still experiencing it. We thought, oh, maybe it's just a phase. But the community got together, folks start rolling their sleeves up and say, honey, we're going to start using this whole virtual experience and asking folks to donate online and donate to help Broadway Cares, help the Actors Fund, to do what we can in little pockets to make a difference. So it's the art community pulling together. When they were pulling together back then, they still pulling together. The arts, the trans, and all of those non-binary, non-gender conforming, two-spirit folks who folks wasn't even letting them sit at the table. They're kicking the doors in and say, oh, you're going to have to use me now.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me so that where we've come as a people, that we're seen as a spectrum, you know, and now, and I'll be honest, when I was younger, it was like, oh, you're gay or straight, and bi was questioned, right? But now we understand that things are a spectrum, and just what Rayceen is talking about is that activism is on a spectrum. And I remember in those early days crying because the lesbians would stand up for the gay men before the gay men would stand up for each other. The white gay community, I should add that inside there. But the idea that we understand differently now what activism is on a spectrum, that art is also on a spectrum. So today, when I see stuff happen about this pandemic differently than the old pandemic, and you have to understand then too that Ronald Reagan couldn't say the word AIDS, didn't say the word AIDS until maybe the last month of his presidency. Maybe, I can't remember if he did or not. Dance Magazine would not print a story about dancers with AIDS until way into the pandemic. It was frustrating and insulting that we were living and dying with this thing, and Dance Magazine couldn't do that. So we took it, as you say, Rayceen, on ourselves to do it. And what I so appreciate now, as I see, is that the art that is being made on screens all over the world, on site all over the world, on stages, yes, and filmed, but we accept that every bit of this evening together is theater together, and it's activism at the same time. And I don't think we trusted that in the old days as much. It's heartening to see this awareness come this way.
Thank you for that. I'm looking at the time, and I want to honor people's time, and I know that there's so many more questions that are also coming up. So I want to make a suggestion. Earlier this summer, we ran into a similar instance where we just didn't have the time to answer all of the questions that we wanted to cover in one session. And so what we did is we collected questions and then had an opportunity to send those out to our speakers and then have answers typed up and written and featured on our website. So I'd like to actually first look to our speakers tonight, and for the sake of time, how does that suggestion sound to you all? I see some thumbs up. Great, thank you. So I'd like to make the proposal that
I'm busy, child, so I might, you know me. I be like, oh, I ain't got time to be writing down them questions, baby. I'm sorry.
And I should preface this by saying that we might not get a response from every single speaker, and that's okay. And I'll make sure to also add my thoughts in too. So thank you for that reminder and that full transparency, Lady Dane. I really appreciate that. So for the sake of time, though, what I do want to do is we're going to close out in just a moment, but as a way to kind of also synthesize and hold on to this conversation, I want to reflect back just a couple small things. First, I want to recognize that like to be in this work, to do this work, to stay in the conversation, it just takes a lot of breathing and letting things settle. So I'm going to go ahead and invite us all to take one big breath together right now. On the count of 3, 2, 1, just take a big deep breath in. And when you're ready, let that breath out. Something else that I'm seeing a lot of, and something that I know has to happen when we're called into this work, but especially even tonight, this might be your call to action. I see a lot of people leaning in. The more we get into the conversation, the more we want to lean in and just really be close to these people. So I'm going to invite us to go ahead and lean in. Go ahead and lean in close to that screen and bring it right back. And then I want to bring back a gesture that Rayceen offered and that Peter amplified and repeated a little bit later, this idea that to do this work, we need to do it together. And to do that, you actually had 2 fingers out like that. And Rayceen, you just kind of, when you said together, you just kind of hooked around like that. Beautiful. So let's go ahead and repeat all of that one more time, our small dance to kind of hold on to what we've just experienced tonight. We'll take a deep breath in. And we'll let that out. And we'll lean into that conversation, lean into that screen, lean into the work that's ahead and bring it back. And we want to recognize that to do this work, to be in this work, to have done this work, there's this sense of togetherness that is needed. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to share how to stay connected to the questions, to the conversation in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to turn to each of our guests and really quickly, in a brief way, I want to ask, is there something else, anything else you'd like us to kind of walk away with tonight, a kind of gift that you want to leave us with? You could think about this as like a building on, a very brief kind of like newspaper headline of building on of what we've talked about, or an opportunity or a way for us to stay connected to you, a kind of plug for what you're doing and how we can kind of support and amplify and be in your amazing presence and work. And I'm going to go ahead and go in order. Jeff, is there a gift that you want to leave us with?
Sure. I will also solicit a gift, which is we're always looking for volunteers with Rainbow History, so rainbowhistory.org, and we will get back to you. The second thing is, I mean, just you matter. I mean, so I think the work and the listening and being on the Zoom, it matters.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jeff. Same question to you, Rayceen. What would you like to leave us with?
What I like to leave you with is, there is a phrase that someone once gave me. I don't know who it belongs to. But when we think about the quiet in a world full of thunder, and 2020 has been full of thunder, but it is the moments that we go into our quiet self, that we do the work of healing, calming our spirit, find the quiet in the world full of thunder. And it is important to do that. Just go in self, in your own self. When you're at home, listen to music that makes you feel good. Listen to people that inspire you, words that inspire you. Sit outside, even in the cold, and breathe in the air, because we have been en mask for so long. That is the quiet in a world full of thunder, the air that you breathe. It is calling someone that you may be angry with and saying, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, is the quiet in the world full of thunder. And if you want to connect with me, I'm on all forms of social media. That's RAYCEEN. And they call me the queen of the plug, shameless plug, because I plug everything. Follow me at Rayceen.com, Team Rayceen on YouTube, and I tweet out every day. So follow me at Twitter, Rayceen, Ask Rayceen, Team Rayceen. Rayceen HRH stands for Her Royal Highness. So follow me on all forms, and I follow back, and I talk, and I tweet, and I connect. Don't think that this is just the first time and the only time we will come together. If you reach out, I reach back. We are forever connected, and that is the quiet in the full of thunder. Thank you so much, everybody. God bless.
Thank you, Her Royal Highness Rayceen. All right, Peter dear, same question.
Sure. I'm learning from Rayceen. I've already written out my email. Email me. I love questions, and there's a couple of websites, including the Stones to Rainbows, which is the current project, and I'm lucky enough to see some people from that project, including you, Matthew, on there. I wanted to say two things. One, I've been watching the beautiful dance of the ASL folks dancing while they're translating what we're doing. And Rodney, I love your nails. and also, I think the patterns in our lives, the ones that are functional and make us happy, keep them. The patterns in our lives that are not, dump them. And that includes people along with the the pattern.
Thank you, Peter. And Lady Dane.
Oh my goodness, child. So listen, I have wrote in the chat. So I do a Thursdays live on Instagram every Thursday at 8 p.m. Normally they're about 30 minutes and/or 45 minutes. So if you want to ask me any questions, child, you got to join me on Instagram tonight at 8 p.m. I might be a little late, child, because I do believe that we have the right to have a rest between doing all the works that we got to do. Rest, honey, rest is sacred. So okay, so that is number one. And then number two, if you know anybody who rich, I I am a part of the Black Trans Prayer Book, and we are raising funds to do a documentary. You can go to theblacktransprayerbook.org and you can learn all about that book that is published. It's about 21 advocates, artists, spirit workers, thought leaders who have come to write poems and poetry and sacred liturgical text that affirm, center, and celebrate trans people. You know, what is a thing that I would say? I guess I would say that continue to do the work of dismantling internalized and systematic white supremacy. I truly believe that the great enemy that must be destroyed in order for all of us, every last one of us, to be able to live in a world in which we are completely and fully affirmed, not just by our communities, but by the culture and by the country that we live in and the space that we occupy, that white supremacy must die. And so I invite everyone to continue to do the work of dismantling that internally and systematically, and to not be tricked by what white supremacy does, which is it makes us believe that the recognition and the acknowledgement of it is enough. That's not the work, that's just the beginning. Then you got to get to work and you got to start doing some work, because it is a practice of proxies, which means that there is action involved. So if there's anything that I could say and you know, leave with the folks this evening, it would be that, because I do believe that a world free of oppression is closer perhaps to us than it has been in a very long time.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Be in the practice. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I want to thank all of our guests. If we can show some applause, bring our hands together, use the reaction button to give some applause, but just some big love and major thanks to all of our speakers tonight. If this was something that you enjoyed, know that there are 2 more Humanitini events coming up this next week. Higher Ed MCs, Hip Hop Leadership and Post-Secondary Education, and Julius Hobson, Maverick for Justice. The link for those events is in the chat. You can get more information there. If this is something you're also really excited about with the work that I do and the people that I love to be in orbit of, you can find me at MatthewCumbie.com, on Facebook and on Instagram, Matthew H. Cumbie, and Growing Our Own Gardens, which is a really kind of foundation for this work. Know that we will be following up with some emails just to say thanks, but also to collect some feedback. So that'll be dropping in inboxes soon. We also want to thank the Humanities DC and the DC Commission for the Arts and Humanities for making tonight possible. A reminder, if you have some questions that you want to funnel to our speakers that can and do have the time to respond, then you can send that to my email, mhcumbie@gmail.com. We'll drop that in the chat, mhcumbie@gmail.com, right there. You can send me your questions, and we will make sure to get that information posted on our website, matthewcumbie.com, as soon as possible. And with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us on Thursday night. This is such an important conversation to be having, and I think such an important time to be having these conversations. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, have a wonderful, wonderful night. I hope you continue to find ways to be together, whatever that togetherness looks like. Thank you, everybody.